What is going on? My name is Jared Haas, and welcome to part four, the final part in our series of In 1986, as we look back into the big storylines and big drivers as well in this series. And none other to bring us along with this series is Frontstretch's own Steve Waid. Steve, I want to talk about big events that happened in 1986. One of the most notorious things that happened was the Challenger, the space shuttle that blew up in January. You remember those big moments, and that was a pretty big moment that kind of happened on the news as it was a pretty big project for them. Where were you at when the Challenger exploded?
Oh gosh, I am sure in January I was at home when that happened. And I had to hear about it over television and the news, of course. And I just stayed glued to television the rest of the day. It was a tough thing to swallow. I can't remember. Of course, there have been some sad times since. Let's make that clear. But I can't remember before then our country ever having been so saddened by an incident that happened like that.
Exactly. And that kind of leads into the sadness of, 1986, talking about Tim Richmond. Kind of his career is a very interesting, unique type of career, but cut sadly very shortly by AIDS. But, you know, s- Tim Richmond actually started out in open wheel. And, with those first couple of years, he ran 1980, 1981 the Indianapolis 500. And his mother, realizing that open wheels are pretty dangerous, wanted him to do another sport. And at this time, Tim Richmond was like, all right, you know what? I still want to do motorsports. And he decided on NASCAR. Tim Richmond's bounced around for a couple teams. 7 different owners were first 5 years. But the big difference between Tim Richmond and other drivers back in the day was his media presence, Steve. And I want to talk about what made him stood out in the media compared to other drivers back in the day, like a Dale Earnhardt or a Jeffrey Bodine.
Yeah. Well, you're exactly right about Tim wanting to start out in IndyCars and do that for a living. In fact, he was the 1980 rookie of the race at the Indianapolis 500, but he kept getting involved in accidents. And his mother, Evelyn, didn't really like that so much. So she suggested to him that he find something else to do. And of course, he picked NASCAR. And when he came into NASCAR, he was pretty much like every other new driver. He had spent some times with not so winning teams. Uh, and one of them, I guess, was with DK Ulrich, an independent driver at the time. Stayed with him for a year, and then moved on to JD Stacy's team, one of JD Stacy's 7 sponsored cars at the time, and then got a pretty good break when he moved over to Raymond Beetle and the Blue Max team, where he hooked up with crew chief Barry Dodson, Eddie Thrapp, engine builder Harold Elliott. So now he had some talent working with him. And Tim had some very good races with Blue Max. That drew the attention of Rick Hendrick. In 1986, Rick Hendrick signed on Tim Richmond to be a sort of a teammate with Jeff Bodine. Now, what happened here that's important to remember is that his crew chief was Harry Hyde. Now, Harry had been around a long time and knew all the tricks and knew what drivers should do to win races. And he became Tim's teacher, Tim's mentor, told him how to stop burning up tires. Don't drive hard when driving hard is not necessary. Do this, do that, listen to me, and you will do well. And Tim did listen to him. And Tim started to do well after the halfway point of the 1986 season. Now, in the first half of the season, he only won one pole position. That was the only thing he did that was headline worthy. But at the same time, here's what made Tim such a headline grabber. Number one, he had movie star good looks. NASCAR had never seen the likes of this guy. And he had an outgoing personality, no question about it. He was very flamboyant. He was a real he was a real outside type of character. They had not seen this before. He became a media magnet because he was very talkative to the press. He's very easy to approach. He was funny. And even though he wasn't doing a whole lot on the track, he was still getting a lot of headlines. Now, it was after the first half of 1986 that everything began to kick in for Tim. By Harry Hyde being his crew chief and being his tutor, Tim's natural talent blended with the experience that Harry gave him, and it erupted into 7 victories and 6 pole positions in the final 16 races of the year. Tim became almost a superstar in less than half a year, and he was in contention for the championship most of the season against Dale Waltrip and Dale Earnhardt, and we've already talked about those two. So he wound up third in the final point standings after winning 7 races, like I said, and 6 poles in the last half of the season. That was really a tremendous supersonic meteor-like rise to fame for him.
Oh, I know. It's very interesting that Tim Richmond, in a 11 race span from the Coca-Cola 600 in Charlotte to the Fall Richmond race, Tim finished top 2 in 9 of those 11 races, which is almost Kyle Busch Xfinity numbers, top tier numbers on that. But I want to circle back to Tim Richmond and Harry Hyde coming together, because Harry Hyde, before the 1986 season, was involved with Jeffrey Bodine. And Bodine and Harry Hyde did not mix well. They were oil and water together.
Sure.
Because I remember actually them reading in, there was actually a story telling them when Harry Hyde and Jeff Bodine got together in the final 10 races, Harry Hyde told Rick Hendrick, "Rick, I love you more than I hate Jeffrey Bodine." And those two guys didn't work together. I want to talk about how much of that was made, those match made in heavens type of crew chief and driver pairings that Harry Hyde was for Tim Richmond. Because Tim Richmond obviously drove open wheel, and open wheel in NASCAR, we've seen it time and time and again, very hard to adapt to.
Right. Well, what you talked about was exactly what the difference was between Tim and Jeff. All right. Jeff knew cars. Jeff Bodine knew cars. He knew how to build them. He knew how to build motors for them. He was pretty much well knowledge in technology when it came to cars, as well as having driving talent. But his knowledge of cars would clash against Harry Hyde because Jeff had his idea of how a car should be set up, and Harry had his, and they never could get them to mesh. Now, the difference with Tim was Tim knew nothing about cars. He had tremendous natural talent. But if you would ask Tim to go build a car, here's a warehouse, go inside. It's got every single piece you need to build a competitive race car. He'd wedge himself in the door trying to run out, okay? But that was fortunate for Harry Hyde because Harry could do to the cars what he wanted to do and tell Tim how to drive those cars set up the way they were. And Tim began to listen. And when Tim began to listen, his natural talent started to merge with everything that Harry had taught him, and he became really a star. I mean, just rising in the second half of that year. That's where it all came together. And that, combined with Tim's outgoing, flamboyant, movie star good looks personality, really propelled him into popularity. By the time that season was over and Tim had done all he could, there was more than one driver that said to me and others, that guy over there, he's the guy that's going to claim that 18 to 35 demographic NASCAR is craving for. He'll get the kids into this sport.
100%. And today, most of the NASCAR fans, the popular demographics is in that 55 to 64-year-olds. And what were they in the 80s? They were in their 18s and 30s. So I think it was definitely, Tim Richmond definitely gained some popularity through that and gained some attention. But it kind of came to a screeching halt right around the end of the 1986 season. Back in the day, he won the season finale at Riverside, had the second best average finish behind, of course, champion Dale Earnhardt. But it seemed like by the at the award ceremony, Tim wasn't looking too well. How did he? And by Daytona, he was nowhere to be found. Before I want to get into his return, what was the timeline for him, and what was going on with him when he was not feeling well?
Well, it was late as the 1986 season progressed and started to come to a close. People started noticing that Tim didn't look too well. He was looking sort of pale, and he wasn't as outgoing as he used to be. We were told repeatedly that he had a slight cold, a heavy cold, a case of the flu. He kept taking antibiotics, and it helped for a while, but he never could get fully recovered. Now, over the winter, going into the winter months, in December 5th, 1986, he went to the banquet in New York, and he was very, very pale, very sweating, very weak. I didn't think he was going to make it, and neither did a lot of other people. But Tim got through that and went away for the rest of the winter. And supposedly, some stories had him going out to California because as they're going to Los Angeles to see if he could be a movie star. Others said he was in a clinic somewhere. Well, what happened was Tim did go to several clinics, but they could not identify what was bothering him. Finally, it was announced by Tim and his people that he had been to the Cleveland Clinic to be treated for double pneumonia. And that's what he said. But he knew by that time that he had AIDS. He absolutely knew by that time. Well, of course, he was in no shape to start the 1987 season. So Rick Hendrick put Benny Parsons in the car to get it going in the hope that Tim would come back. Now, eventually, Tim did come back, but he never was the same after that. Now, in this comeback, rather, it was quite a show. He won his first two races that he entered at Pocono and Michigan. And that was just like a Hollywood tale in itself, a great comeback. But he still was not a healthy boy, not at all.
And that's what I wanted to bring into is because in 1987 won those first two races after that hiatus. Was there any really those expectations coming in that, you know what, he's just going to come back and win those races? And, at Pocono, he dominated and led the most laps there. What was at that point of the race where you're like, well, Tim Richmond's actually going to win this race after being out for so long?
Well, the thing, it sort of intensified his legend at that time. The guy has been sick. The guy comes back, wins two in a row. Man, fantastic. He's on his way back. Well, a lot of people sort of believe that, but if you saw Tim at that time, you knew he was still not healthy. As a matter of fact, as each race progressed after that, Tim got worse and worse. And the last race he ran was the second Michigan race. I saw Tim at that race firsthand. He was out of it. I don't think he knew where he was. I don't think he knew what he was doing. They had to chase him down to take him out to qualifying in a golf cart. And he qualified 29th. And he started the race and never really, in my opinion, got up to speed. As a matter of fact, he finished 29th in that race. And that was the last race Tim Richmond ever ran in NASCAR. And you could definitely see a different Tim Richmond then as the Tim Richmond you had seen over a year ago. Definitely a difference.
Yeah, sadly, Tim Richmond passed away in 1989 through AIDS. A lot of that wasn't known for the time how AIDS were causes. We've dealt with that with more recently with COVID. There's not a lot of information that was out for that,
Sure.
and sadly, he passed away with his autoimmune system not preventing those diseases entering his body. Steve, I want to at least end on a positive note with Tim Richmond passing away. He was starting to build an impressive resume with Hendrick Motorsports. He had a 24% winning percentage with Hendrick Motorsports in the short time that he raced with him. If you added a couple more, 4, 5, 6 seasons with him, if he was healthy and still in his ways, could add another championship. I'm going to add a twofold question. obviously Tim Richmond would make the Hall of Fame, but do you think Tim Richmond makes the Hall of Fame as his current stats stand?
Well, let's put it this way. If Tim Richmond remained healthy, okay, we'd be talking about a lot of different stats and a lot of different numbers and a lot of change in NASCAR history. I am convinced that if Tim Richmond had stayed healthy, stayed with Hendrick, stayed with Hyde, there's no telling how far up he would have been able to go. He would have been a champion. Maybe Dale Earnhardt wouldn't win the 7 championships. Who knows? But I think he definitely would have been a champion. And if it reached that stage in his career, he would definitely be in line for the Hall of Fame. Now, as it stands right now, I'm not sure he's going to be able to make it on the present stats at all. There's more reasons for that as well. Let's be honest, Jared, we didn't know anything about AIDS back then. And we know a lot more now than we did back then. But still, I know this is going to sound kind of harsh to some of Tim's biggest fans, and he still has them, by the way. That stigma that's still with him, fair or unfair, is going to be a block to the Hall of Fame. Now, it may be ignored in the long run, but when you consider the ongoing number of people who are going to be candidates for the Hall of Fame, obviously going to be Hall of Fame. We can sit here and name them all day, and we know they are going to be candidates. Tim Richmond is not among them as an obvious candidate for several reasons, like I've already mentioned. But boy, I'm telling you, racing NASCAR, I would have loved to have seen what the record book would look like today if Tim Richmond had stayed healthy. The numbers and the names and certainly the Hall of Fame, to me, would be much different.
Absolutely. I think he was on track with that.
Sure.
It's going to be tough, with those, with the voting system definitely hurts his chances with a lot less people getting in now than it was, when the Hall of Fame started out. It was five, now it's three drivers. It's going to be tough to see. Obviously, it's going to depend on what this current crop of drivers are going to be doing, how many of those Hall of Fame drivers are going to be, you know, their
Right.
stats are going to overshadow those other drivers as well. But it definitely put NASCAR on the map. It's going to be one of those we'll have to see. But Steve, it was great talking with you. Talk about 1986. I hope you guys enjoyed this series. And from everyone here at Frontstretch.com, make sure to subscribe. And as always, as I say, have a great race weekend.
Jared Haas with Frontstretch.com. Make sure to hit that subscribe button. Also, check one of those two videos out that we have right beside you. Visit Frontstretch.com for more great content.